Hello and welcome to the Hoover Institution's 2014 Southern California Conference. I'm Chris Dower, Hoover's Director of Marketing and Strategic Communications. Our speaker in this podcast is Eric Wakin, a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and the Director of Hoover's Library and Archives. The title of his talk is Who Owns History? The Use and Abuse of the Hoover Archives, and it was recorded on January 30th, 2014.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for talking over your lunch. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I was going to start with an introduction, but I wanted to just let you know what attracted a New Yorker from the Upper West Side of Manhattan to move with his family, 3 children and wife, to California. And the Hoover, the only housing market with parity prices to Manhattan is, of course, Palo Alto. I knew from when I started studying for my dissertation the depth and value of the collections in the Hoover Library and Archives. And I knew that for a long time. And I knew the reputation of the policy side. And let me tell you, when I saw that the job for Director of Library and Archives was open, I couldn't jump fast enough to apply to come out here. And it's such a pleasure to be part of really helping to steward the legacy of the Library and Archives portion of the institution. It's just a fantastic experience. So thank you for letting me come. I have a brief presentation which I've called The Use and Abuse of the Hoover Institution's Library and Archives, which has some interesting stories. But before I get into that, I'm just going to do a brief few minutes on what's in the Library and Archives. What is it? And, why is it here? Why is it part of the institution? These are the words of Herbert Hoover. He said many, many things about the Hoover Institution, but you should know that it began as the Hoover War Library. Before there was any work on policy, it was a library which built into an archive. But under the idea, if you will, of Herbert Hoover, that it should point the road to peace, to personal freedom, and to the safeguards of the American system, we grew. And the original Hoover Institution was a lot of people doing research on the collections in the library, and that's grown to an enormous policy side which does research all over the world, not so much using the library and archives. I like to say the legacy, what we're about at the Library and Archives, is the legacy of history in America and around the world. We preserve, make available the most important material about political, social, and economic change in the world. And this is a legacy to future generations. You don't have to take my word for it or think I'm overusing the word legacy. In 1982, Ronald Reagan said, the institution's library and archives are a valuable national resource. And in that picture, you'll see President Reagan is receiving a copy of one of our posters. We have 120,000 posters in our collection. And President Reagan had spoken about a diary of a World War I soldier, which is represented in that poster. And when we heard of that, senior fellow Martin Anderson visited the White House and gave President Reagan a copy of the poster. So what I like to think we do is preserve this legacy. We compare ourselves, as you've heard, we collect around the world. We compare ourselves to our other institutions, and you heard from Colin, with the second largest private archive of any kind in the United States. We have 11,000 visitors from 35 countries last year, and they looked at 44,000 boxes of material. 9 Pulitzer Prize-winning books since 2000 have come out of collections in our library. Last year alone, over 80 books were published with material from our collections. Things you may not hear about, but are in the public sphere, and many, many documentary films. Now, let's get to the good stories. That's Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, who was researching in the Soviet Union in the 1970s under communism. Hoover Library and Archives smuggled documents that we had in this country into the Soviet Union behind the Iron Curtain so he could work on his books. When he finally came out of the Soviet Union, he was kind enough to say, in my own country, Russia, I had no access to archival materials. Here, I have open access to the richest archival materials. And what I like to say about the archives is that we don't collect in support of or opposed to any policy. We collect history and in support of research. And if that research is on policy, that's great. And if that research is on Boris Pasternak being translated from Russian to Italian, that's great too. The point is that we are open to all comers, and as you'll see in a few of my stories, that has particular ramifications around the world. And were open to the public. And that's important when you think about what President Hoover said about the American way of life. It's open access and it's freedom. It's a free access to these ideas to make of what you may, even if the conclusions some people come from our collections are things that I find personally abhorrent, and you'll see that in one of these collections. We counter that by more use of free information and more correctives using the information we have in the archives. So I'm going to transition to 4 brief stories of how material in the archives have been used in policy, in exhibits, and in a few ways around the world, and then I'll open up for questions. So the first one I want to talk about is on Gulag, labor camps in the Soviet Union, going back in history. This is a map of forced labor camps in the Soviet Union. During World War II, the institution's archives received interview notes from thousands and thousands and thousands of Poles who were imprisoned in Soviet labor camps from 1939 to 1941 and 1942. And the Polish government in exile in London amassed this collection, donated it to the Hoover Library, and the interview notes were looked through and collated to see where labor camps existed in the Soviet Union. And then they published this map, which is a map of forced labor camps in the Soviet Union in 1947. It was called one of the most widely circulated pieces of anti-communist literature in the United States in the 1950s. That is an actual documentation of where people were held in forced labor camps. Now, many people come to the Hoover Archives today to use that very collection of survivors of labor camps. They don't care about the labor camps, they care about genealogy. And they want to know about their grandmother or their great-grandmother or great-grandfather because of the records of this collection. And what I like to do as the director of the Library and Archives is say that's wonderful. It's wonderful to use this material to document. It's horrible to use the material to document the terror of the Gulag. It's wonderful we have it for genealogists who want to use information about their family. And it's a powerful symbol of what we do at the Hoover. Come and look at it for your own purposes. So that's one story. I'm going to segue to a more recent story, but also vaguely about the Cold War, about Afghanistan. When the communist Soviet Union collapsed, Hoover had this one moment of sort of openness with the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, where they opened up some of their archives, some of their private Communist Party archives. And we arranged an agreement with them in the 1990s to copy a big portion of the archives. For us, it would be a big portion, but a small portion of what's actually there. And there was a moment of openness for about 2 years where we managed to microfilm, which of course was the state of art of preservation in 1992, millions of pages of documents. We published the highlights of this in a book, which is called Fond 89. Fond is an archival term for a collection of material. But the interesting thing about this material is that some of it is no longer available in Russia. Material opens up. We copy it, it closes down. You can only find it in the Hoover Library and Archives. And 2 Hoover fellows, Joe Felter and Katya Drozdova, study the records of the Soviet experience in Afghanistan. Joe Felter actually was in command of the ISAF Counterinsurgency Advisory Assistance Team in 2010, 2011 in Afghanistan. And he went to the archives of the Hoover Institution to look at the records of the Soviet invasion and particularly the record of how the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan. He mined these secret notes. By the way, the document on the right is labeled in Russian both top secret and special folder. So top secret corresponds to American top secret. Special folder would be essentially sensitive compartmentalized information, a very high level of top secret. And it details what the Soviet Union should be considering in withdrawing from Afghanistan. Now, you know what we're going through in this country in Afghanistan. Some of the things that the Soviets talked about were not unlike what we're going through. The documents go into minute detail about where they should be concerned at that moment in history, which highways to protect, where to provide food and logistics, who to assist with materiel, whether Soviet pilots should be flying Afghani planes, what kind of economic assistance to use. And what Joe Felter told me was that he briefed multiple senior military officials and other government officials on the Soviet experience of withdrawing from Afghanistan using this material as part of it. And to me, that's wonderful that we can provide that kind of service. At the same time, it's wonderful if a scholar wants to study some other aspect of the Soviet interaction in Afghanistan. I'll segue to my next story. Red Star over China. I had the pleasure of going to Shanghai about a month ago for a number of reasons. One was to give a talk at Fudan University. One was to meet a descendant of Chiang Kai-shek, about some diaries we have. But I thought while I was there, let me go to the Shanghai Municipal Archives, because they have asked us over the years to borrow materials to put in an exhibit. And again, as a library with open access, if the Municipal Archives in Shanghai asks for some copies, we give them to them, as we would anywhere else. But I thought, let's see how they're actually using them. So the exhibit is called, at the Shanghai Municipal Archives, Red Star Over China, which is the title of a 1937 book about the Communist Army. And what they've done is they've taken the material from some of our collections and other collections to show Chinese communists in the eyes of foreign journalists. Now, you might imagine they come to a very different conclusion about the value of the People's Republican Army, PLA, People's Liberation Army, than we might in the United States. They open with a celebration. This exhibition will provide us with an opportunity to go into the China under Red Star again and experience those heroic and magnificent years as recorded by foreign journalists. That's the entree to the exhibit. China's an amazing place, as you know, if you do business there, right? Amazing capitalist business society, in some way overlain by a society with a corrupt party apparatus that gets in the way. But anyway, so I looked at the exhibit, and they had this as the forward. We have these wonderful pictures in our archives of Chairman Mao. This is Mao, 1937, looking rakish with his cap tilted to the side. We got that collection from a woman named Nim Wales. That was her journalistic name, but her married name was Helen Foster Snow. She was married to Edgar Snow, who wrote the book Red Star Over China. And she visited Mao in Yan'an in 1937, took these pictures, gave them to the Hoover Institution archives, stored them here, and then the Shanghai Municipal Archives wants these wonderful pictures of Mao to use in an exhibit, so they borrowed them. They also took an excerpt from her book. Through their strong leadership, the Chinese communists have created a lofty and great human civilization. So it's about for me, it's about, as a historian, it's about picking and choosing the data you might use in a certain way. Now, we have these collections because journalists had the foresight of mind to donate them to us. That's the concluding remarks of the exhibit. It's more of the same. And I don't have a comment on it except to say, as Lenin might say, what is to be done? What do we do about this? What do we do about this problem where archives are taken and represented in one way? Well, I say we take and represent them in a different way, and we talk about why it's important that we have certain materials in the United States. So let me segue to my last story, which is a kind of corrective to the previous one. It's about the Luding Bridge, which is a bridge in China. But first I want to start with this famous painting. That's George Washington crossing the Delaware, painted by a German-American. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's what I like to think of as a boy, when I was a boy anyway, one of the iconic paintings of American history. It's a fanciful portrait of George Washington crossing the Delaware, December 25th and 26th, 1776, painted by a German-American. There's all sorts of things wrong with it from a historian's perspective, but it doesn't matter. Iconographically, it's a wonderful painting. The original of that painting, painted in 1850, long after the Revolution, by a guy named Lutzi, went back to Germany. During World War II, that painting was destroyed by British bombers, 1942, in a bombing raid, which American historians like to joke that was their way to pay us back for the Revolution. There was a second copy of that painting. The second copy of that painting is in the Metropolitan Museum. So why is that important? Let's imagine that there was no second copy of that painting, and that painting was only in Germany, and it hadn't been destroyed by the war. How would Americans feel about this sort of iconographic American painting being in a foreign country? I'm going to leave you with that because this is another famous painting. This is one of the most important images of the Chinese Revolution. It's called the Luding Bridge. If you don't study Chinese, you may not know the story, but when Mao Zedong went in his historic retreat called the Long March up into the mountains of Yan'an, along the way, there was a famous battle, and it was quite a famous battle where there was a bridge made of giant chains of iron across a bridge, across a river, with planks on the bottom. It was built in 1701. And in the fight against the nationalists and the communists attacked the bridge from one side. The nationalists didn't want to blow it up, or their warlords didn't want to blow up the bridge because it had historic value. So they pulled up the planks from the bottom of the bridge. This is a true story. The communists did fight across, climbing across the chains 22 men fought across with covering fire to get to the other side and take the bridge. It's a sort of story with as much power as George Washington crosses the Delaware in America has for us as this does in China. Where do you find the original of that painting? At the Hoover Institution. Now, how would you feel if the most iconographic, one of the most important images for your history of modern China was not in China but was at the Hoover Institution? How did it get there? Well, Helen Foster Snow, the woman who took the pictures of Chairman Mao, befriended the artist. The artist gave her his 26 sketches. His name is Huang Jin. And she took them back to the United States. She donated them to Hoover, and they're here. Now, no one would have seen them because we kind of kept them under wraps for a while. But it turned out that, let me go back before I go back there. It turned out that the Chinese ambassador to the United States got wind that we had these original iconographic things that had been reproduced all over China, and he wanted to see them. So he flies from D.C. to Stanford to look at them, not just for himself, because it turns out that a fellow named Dai Bingguo, who's the very high foreign affairs official in China, vice minister for foreign affairs, the equivalent to national security minister, a national security advisor, is married to the daughter of the man who did these paintings. So the ambassador flies to Hoover to look at them, flies back to D.C., calls China. Dai Bingguo comes over just to see these paintings. Now, his daughter, again, is the daughter of the artist. She has never traveled out of the country with her husband except for this trip. She told me, all of my life, I thought these paintings were lost. I've never traveled without my husband out of the country. I'm coming to Hoover to see these. The ambassador flies in. The foreign minister, Dai Bingguo, flies in. They come to look at the artwork. And, of course, there's the awkward question, well, how did you get these exactly? So, well, they were given to us by Helen Foster Snow. Well, how did she get them? Well, the artist, I'm sorry, your father gave them to her. So we had a long conversation about these, and we showed them the 26 of them, and I gave her a copy of every one on a CD. We made a book for her of them because it's her father's work. And what happens at the end of the visit? We have a guest book in the Hoover. It's called the De Basili Room. I hope you guys can visit it sometime. We have a guest book of famous visitors. On the right is a comment from Dai Bingguo, this fellow who's in the foreign ministry. The long march happened in China. It is also it's a terrible translation, by the way, but I'll fix that later. It's also recorded in the War History of Human Beings. We sincerely appreciate that the Hoover Institution elaborately collected the suite of paintings of this subject. You have made a significant contribution. So here is someone from the People's Republic arguing that it's only that Hoover did a great thing preserving these. And I think that's a symbol of people around the world, from wherever they are in the political spectrum, knowing that if there's a neutral place that you can preserve things for history where it's going to last forever, that's a very good thing. And if you look really carefully at the fellow on the left, I'm going to step out just to use my laser pointer once. On the other side of the page is Jerry Yang from Yahoo. So you got Jerry Yang from Yahoo on one side, and you've got Dai Bingguo, the foreign policy administration official on the other. And even more ironically and interestingly, what Jerry Yang is visiting is what we have as the diaries of Chiang Kai-shek. And what Jerry Yang writes on one side is the incredible collection of the Chiang Kai-shek diaries, a true treasure. And what Dai Bingguo writes is, of course, a significant contribution. And for me, that's the corrective, that people on both sides of the political spectrum can realize that an archives is I'm going to do the kumbaya moment, a space where there are things kept for all sides to look at and preserve for generations, and that's a good thing. That's the end of my story. So thank you.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution. Thank you for listening.